Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food systems storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org. This episode is brought to you by Somerset County Tourism. Hear stories from local brewers and distillers from the New Jersey Sip and See Trail on episode 647 of Beer Sessions Radio, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host here on Beer Sessions Radio. It's the week of October 5th, 2022. We're doing a remote recording with a good friend and a beer legend from Buffalo, New York. So, Ethan, introduce yourself, please.
Sure. I'm Ethan Cox. I'm a co-founder and co-owner of Community Beer Works here in Buffalo. And prior to that, lots of home brewing and beer judging and beer history writing and, lots of different hats.
No, Ethan's an esteemed brewer and authority in the state, in the region. And I remember I met you, 5 or 6 years ago. You were at a New York State event in New York City. And I drank the Community Beer Works Whale, which you had made. I know you've made a lot of great beers, and I think this is a good show to talk about Buffalo because I love regional identities. So, Buffalo, what's Buffalo style pizza?
Yeah. Buffalo style pizza. Buffalo style pizza is something that we here very much cherish. It's a little bit of a cross between New York style and maybe Chicago, in the sense that it's a little bit of a thicker crust, so it's a little bit more bready. It's not usually got too much salt to it, so it doesn't really make you thirsty as much. You're going to have a somewhat sweet sauce, semi-sweet, and then your mozz. But the almost critical point, if you're going to have pepperonis on your pizza, and you don't have to, you can have Italian sausage, you can have your olives, whatever it is you like. But in Buffalo, if your pepperoni isn't the little cup and char variety, then you are definitely not doing it right. Cup and char is critical to the Buffalo pizza.
So what are those, the little cup pepperonis?
Yeah, it's just a smaller, thicker slice that in the oven, they're at 900 degrees or 850 or whatever, starts to curl up, get charred around the edge, and then it captures just a little bit of grease in each one, and it makes such a huge difference.
Oh wow, man, it sounds really good. Is it thick crust or thin?
It's pretty thick. It's definitely thick compared to like your Neapolitan style or even your Detroit style. It's a little thicker than that even too.
Oh wow, it sounds really good. Yeah, no, we're used to eating the pizza at Roberta's Pizza in Bushwick. Big shout out to them. Old World. Yes, I could say that's Neapolitan style. Wood-fired pizza. Yeah. So just more backstory on you, because I've never really got a chance to talk the whole 9 yards with you. Ethan Cox,
Sure.
Community Beer Works. When did you start brewing, and what's the story of Community Beer Works?
Sure. Well, for myself anyway, I started home brewing in college because I studied abroad. I studied in Ireland. I was 19, and when I was living in Ireland, I was allowed to just go to the pub and drink beer. So I started acquiring better taste for beer. I drank a fair amount of Guinness, but also Irish red ales and even Belgian styles, which I hadn't really ever seen or had in the U.S., were sometimes available there. So I came back to Boston. I was at Northeastern University, and I came back to Boston, and I couldn't buy beer, and I thought that was silly. But I found out I could buy a beer making kit and all the ingredients. So I said, okay, simple. I'll start making my own beer. Um, and that's how I began homebrewing. I continued to homebrew all the way through graduate school, and then when we moved back to Buffalo in 2005 2006, I joined one of the local homebrewing clubs. And knowing that I wasn't really going to move again for the foreseeable future, I really dived deep. So the Sultans of Swig is one of the two homebrewing clubs here in Buffalo. They're great guys. I joined the Niagara Association of Homebrewers. It's one of the other big ones. And over the course of years, besides doing a lot of brewing and entering in competitions and winning some awards, I also, I got involved like organizationally. I became vice president and president. I also started helping out with the organization of the competitions. Even doing as much as being like the judge director and the overall competition organizer and things like that. So went pretty far down the homebrewing rabbit hole. And then in around 2010, me and a buddy, Dave by name, got it into our minds that Buffalo could certainly use more breweries. At that time, around then there was really only one brewery in Buffalo that was a craft brewery. All of our historic breweries had gone out of business in the early '70s, and the one attempt at getting a microbrewery, what they would have called a microbrewery at the time, to get that up and running had already come and gone. So in 2000, somebody, a guy named Tim and his partners, started a brewery called Flying Bison. And in 2010, they were still the only brewery in Buffalo. So me and a group of friends, my friend Dave and a few other people, got organized and opened up Community Beer Works. We got started around 2012. We started out as a nano-brewery, which is a term you don't hear so much anymore. But at the time, it was a pretty hot idea because everybody knew getting into brewing was expensive. Brewing equipment is, very not cheap. And, businesses are hard too. So we started out at a very, very small scale, making beer a barrel and a half at a time, which is not a lot of beer. Talking about 3 half kegs per batch. Yeah, almost crazy, really. But at the time, it was a viable model for getting underway. It wasn't going to last. You're going to have to scale at some point, but it was proof of concept.
Did you have a fancy pilot system? What were you using?
We did. We bought this pretty cool system from a company called Stout Kettles and Tanks. They're still around in Portland, Oregon. And it was cool. We bought from them. We bought the whole brew house as well as our fermentation. We started out fermenting, actually doing our temperature control just by building all these little rooms that the fermenters were in and temperature controlling the room, so air control rather than glycol. Which is crude, but it got it done more or less. We got good beers out of that system for as long as we used it. By the time we were done there in 2018, we were actually doing like 4 batches in a day into a 7-barrel fermenter because we had continued to grow and we had to make more beer. So a brew day became like 4 batches back to back, which was crazy.
Wow.
And that's why
Ethan, what was your first customer? Where did you sell those first half kegs of beer?
Oh, that's an awesome question, Jimmy. Let me tell you. There are two bars in town that were really the champions of craft beer at that time, and they're right next door to one another, conveniently enough. So one is called Mr. Good Bar, and the other's called Cole's. The owner of Cole's is a guy named Mike Schatzel, and if you know the Buffalo beer scene, his name might be familiar to you.
We know Mike. Yep.
Yeah, he owns a brewery called Thin Man. And the other bar is owned by a guy named Bobby. And the two of them were instrumental, really, in developing the craft beer scene in this town and inspiring a bunch of other brewers and breweries to get underway because they knew that they would have somewhere to sell their beer. You don't start and then break out into the football arena right off the bat. So those were our first two accounts. Actually, not long after we opened, Mike opened a second bar called the Blue Monk, which was kind of famous, and that was like our third account. So we owe those guys a huge debt of gratitude for championing us and buying our beer right off the bat.
Wow. I know a guy
Yeah.
named Ryan Bedford. I think he managed at the Blue Monk.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he came to New York. I knew him from he managed a number of bars here.
Yeah, he was at the Double Windsor the last time I knew him to be in the business. I think he may have gone back into marketing or advertising or graphic design because I know that was one of his interests too. But yeah, good dude, Ryan. He was awesome.
So you guys kept growing. Wow. I mean, again, back to that startup. I mean, it just seems so quaint and innocent back then when there were people getting licensed like Blind Bat on Long Island or Bridge and Tunnel in Queens.
Oh yeah, Paul.
They literally had a garage that was separate from their home. With the zoning, they were able to get licensed as a small production brewery.
Yeah. Paul's a good dude. I know him because we started out around the same time. So we had a lot of similar problems and we did a lot of problem solving together. I haven't seen him in a couple of years now, but he's still at it, and I'm happy for him for that. It's not easy. But you're right. I mean, it was kind of like, I don't know, romantic isn't quite the word for it, but I mean, there was just a lot of hustle in those days, and you felt like anything was possible and that unlimited growth was possible. We self-distributed at that time, and that was mostly me, actually. I wasn't the brewer there because we had somebody else who actually knew how to brew too. And, there was a need for actually moving the beer. So we bought a van and I drove beer all over Buffalo, thousands of miles of deliveries over the course of years. Not to mention, my back, and my legs, and everything else I paid for it. But it was great, actually. Self-distribution, that phase of the company's growth was actually pretty great because, I was doing sales as well as marketing, as well as logistics and delivery. I'd roll in there and I would talk to the owners, talk to the managers, talk to the bartenders, try to get them excited about the brand. Sometimes I had to tell them that they owed me money, by the way. And by the way, here's more beer anyway.
Oh yeah.
So it was a lot of work. It was exhausting. Those 2 days of the week that I did deliveries, I would come home and just, more or less collapse. But it was good. It was intimate, and I felt like I knew my customers, not the people who were actually buying the beer at the bar, but the people who were buying the beer for the bar.
Yeah. And they knew you were coming, and that adds a lot of value to the experience. It does. It's lasting relationships.
Yeah, to this day, there's a lot of places I go into, and they're like, "Hey, man," So that is pretty cool, and I think it contributed greatly to the growth of the brand. That I could be that one of the owners was really also the brand ambassador. Eventually, we did hire a salesperson because it turns out it's not easy to try to sell people beer while you're also collecting money they owe you. Those really should be two different jobs. Once we had a sales guy, I was less involved with new accounts, and we'd get new accounts. I'd be like, I've never been to that place. I don't know anyone there. And I started to feel a little bit more removed from those customers. But but it was great for the first few years. And I really, I look back on those years fondly, even
Oh
though
yeah.
there was a lot of labor.
So
Yeah.
it seems like naturally you have a gift for organizational skills. You were organizing homebrew club, you know, tastings and all that. Um, how,
Yeah.
how did you grow as part of Community Beer Works in that regard?
Well, I mean, at the point where we realized we just had to scale up in a way that we couldn't do at the place we were with the equipment we had, um, me and one of the other partners, a guy named Chris Smith, spent a good couple of years trying to find the investment cash and the location where we could expand. And after throwing a lot of darts at a lot of boards, we finally got a bullseye. We finally got some investors who were interested in helping us move into a bigger space and grow the brand more. So that was around 2017, 2018. And the next thing that I got to do that was really a lot of fun was design the brewery. We hired an architect and a construction company and everything that you need for that. We commissioned a brew house from a company down in Virginia, I think they were. And that was all new and exciting for me as well. Meeting with an architect, coming up with the vision for the space. I mean, we rehabbed an old building on the west side of Buffalo. So the dimensions, the envelope was kind of given, but I got to imagine what the tap room would look like and execute on that. I got to imagine what the brew house, the brewing side would look like and execute on that. It was a lot of fun. It was also, a new skill set for me, but very, very rewarding.
Wow, man.
And we got that brewery up and running by, sometime in 2018 or so is when we finally opened that new brewery, and that's where we brew to this day.
Well, that's great. Hey, so tell me more about the
Yeah.
west side of Buffalo. Is that where you're from?
The west side is the best side. Yeah, I like to think I'm from the west side. There's a little bit more west side you could be from than the house I actually literally grew up in. But Buffalo is kind of divided east and west by Main Street, of all streets. And I'm definitely on the west side of Main Street. And growing up, that's where I played. That's where I ran around.
So what's the difference west and east?
Well, the west side is, in general, it's the side of town that's closer to the river. It is definitely the part of town where you see the most immigrants. Buffalo right now is getting immigrants from a lot of really cool countries, and they are mostly settling in various pockets of the west side. Historically, it was the part of town that also had a lot of concentration of Italians, and there's a legacy of that in some of the businesses that are still operating and some of the restaurants that are still operating. But that population, gentrified like they do and kind of moved out to the suburbs and made way for the next immigrant wave, which was mostly Spanish speakers, a lot from Puerto Rico and from the Caribbean in general. Um, and so yeah, so that's the west side, whereas the east side is majority black population, and it has a different vibe for sure, but also really cool.
So Buffalo's a real city.
People.
I've never been to Buffalo, and then we did one show. We talked to
Yeah.
Mike
Okay.
Shaxel about Thin
You gotta
Man.
come.
But I do know Oaks, Jonathan Oaks. He's a
Jonathan Oaks,
cider and winery, steampunk cider.
That's right.
So
Yep, he's a good dude. He's a good dude. Yeah, you come on up here and we will show you a good time. I guarantee it.
Oh, I know that. There's a reputation in Buffalo. I remember definitely Buffalo is a good alcohol town, which is actually that's how I classify places now. Are they good alcohol towns or not? I mean, everybody parties, but not everybody parties.
Sure. Well, Buffalo does have a reputation. I mean, just look at the Bills fan base. They're the best tailgate in the entire NFL, and anybody who thinks otherwise is wrong. No question about that. And also, we're a blue collar town. So our bars, they all close at 4. That's a legacy from having third shift workers who wanted to get a beer when they got off at midnight or 1.
Well, all bars close at 4 a.m. That's amazing.
All bars can close at 4. I mean, there's certainly some bars that shut down at 1 or 2 because, they're good. But yeah, no, there's plenty of bars that still go till 4. And some of those bars open again at 6.
Wow.
So,
So you
yeah.
also, in addition to being a co-founder and brewer at a well-known brewery, you wrote a book about Buffalo beer. When did
Yeah.
you write that? Tell us a little bit about that, because I didn't know that side of you, and I'm realizing
Oh.
you have a lot of knowledge.
Well, the book was published in 20 thanks. The book was published in 2015. I didn't write it by myself. I have a co-author. His name is Mike Rizzo. He's the lead author, and he actually did more of the writing itself. We shared a lot of the research, and I wrote all the captions, and I also got all the photographs
Oh wow!
because I knew people in town who had access to different kinds of archives and like cool old breweriana and stuff like that. But yeah, it was a joint effort, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it by myself. Mike Rizzo, who was my writing partner, also already had published several books. So he was really the one that it was Arcadia Publishing that came to him basically and said, "Hey, we're doing a series of history books, beer history books for all these different regions. Would you be interested in doing the one from Buffalo?" And then he reached out to me and said, "Look, I can write, but let's work on this together, especially because you can help market it because you've got a brewery," which is true. So it was a joint effort, but it was absolutely fascinating to jump into the history of Buffalo's brewing industry. It's so many good stories in there. We had a lot of breweries before Prohibition came around. At one time, we had as many as 37 or 38 breweries. That was in the 1870s. But then there was a period of consolidation, as you might expect. And by the eve of Prohibition, we were rocking about 19 breweries, but we were also producing 4 or 5 times as much beer as we were when we had like 38. So Buffalo's brewing industry, like a lot, grew and grew very fast, especially in the period between 1870 and Prohibition, fueled mostly by German immigrants who were coming to Buffalo and coming with either a thirst or a desire to quench that thirst by starting a brewery. So we did pretty well for ourselves.
Yeah, what were some of the Buffalo breweries of note from back then?
Oh yeah, well the biggest one before Prohibition was a brewery called Lang's. That's Lang. Lang, like all of these guys, came from somewhere in Germany and grew his brewery from something really tiny. Actually, he started out working in somebody else's brewery, and then struck out on his own. And by the time Prohibition hit, Lang alone was producing a couple 100,000 barrels a year, and the Buffalo brewing industry itself was producing almost 1 million barrels a year across all those 19 breweries. So it was a large industry. Um, but what's interesting, so Lang was one of them. One of the other big ones that you hear about is Iroquois. Um, and they, as the name suggested, used a lot of like Native American motifs in their advertising. It's not very PC anymore, but in the 1800s, people weren't able to complain about it so much yet. But they did really well for themselves. Another brewery that was a big one is the William Simon Brewery. And in fact, those last two that I mentioned are two of the ones that actually managed to reopen after Prohibition. Lang's, as big as it was, did not. They spent that time diversifying the business, and by the time beer was legal again, they were like, "We're good. We do bakery, we do real estate, we do dairy. We're all set." Um, but yeah, 19 breweries closed. About 8 or 9 breweries reopened when Prohibition ended. William Simon was one of those. The Christian Weigh-In Brewery became like the owner of the Iroquois brand, and so they reopened as Iroquois. And a couple others reopened. Phoenix was one too.
You know what?
One of my other favorites is
Just right before Prohibition, what styles of beer were they making? What were the ones that people were
ah,
drinking? Do you know?
hmm well, yeah, the record there is a little bit thinner because you really have to just find the old labels. It's not really talked about in the newspapers quite as much. People didn't care as much about like all the particular brands, right? There wasn't like a brewery didn't make, I don't know, 30 or 40 different types of beer in a year, right? They just made their three or four brands. Mostly they did make light lagers, not a huge surprise. That was what the Germans brought with them. The brewing industry prior to the Germans showing up had more ales and porters, but as you got more and more German breweries, you got a lot more of those light lagers. They did make wheat beers or Weiss beers, absolutely. And we even have some evidence to show that they made a Berliner Weiss, or one of the breweries made a Berliner Weiss. So they actually made a sour,
Wow.
which you don't think about as being, you think of that as being like really a modern thing, but it's not. So they had some diversity. They didn't probably make a lot of ales, but there were a couple British style breweries that also kind of made it all the way up to Prohibition. They didn't get totally swamped by the Germans. And they were making some ales and porters and stuff like that. But yeah, mostly on the lighter side.
Ethan, before you worked on the book, did you have the same interest in the beer history of Buffalo, or did this kind of spark it?
I certainly had a little bit of an interest. Like I had enough interest that I wanted to know more. And I was aware of the 2 or 3 buildings that were former brewery buildings that, kind of intrigued me. I just sort of wondered what they were all about. The other thing, though, that was happening around the same time as our brewing industry was our malting industry. And this we very, very only barely touched on in the book because there's really nowhere near as much historical record about what was happening with malting. If you're a malting company, your only customer is breweries. So you don't leave a lot of advertising, beer trays and coasters and stuff like that. The malting companies didn't have all that kind of stuff. But we had 3 or 4 malting companies in Buffalo that were huge. They were so big that there is no way that their grain was only being used in Buffalo. They were exporting their grain probably everywhere they could in about a 500-mile radius. That includes New York City, Pittsburgh, Philly, probably Chicago, Detroit, Boston,
Ohio,
maybe even into Canada. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Cincinnati.
And you think were they getting all their grain from Western New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio?
They were getting their game. They were getting it mostly from the American Midwest. One of the reasons that Buffalo became this giant milling center was the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes. So all that grain was being shipped across the Great Lakes, and then it had to be offloaded into a grain elevator and then loaded back onto a canal boat to take it down to the Hudson and out the mouth there in New York. So because we had the Erie Canal, we had all of these grain elevators. And because we had all these grain elevators, the malting companies and some of the grain elevator companies just became maltsters. They're like, wait, we're sitting on a bunch of grain. We can make it like worth even more by malting it. So
wow,
that's how that happened. But it was, it's a pretty exciting part of the story, but it's one that was a lot harder to research and substantiate, unfortunately. But we know that those maltsters were huge. You can just see the old buildings and how big they were.
That's really cool. Yeah, I don't think I've had anyone talk about malt history before ever. So maybe for that reason.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Even though we talk a lot about craft malt, I mean, we definitely talk about and the origins of grain and malt, but we haven't really talked about that era. So it's like 1870s to Prohibition. That's like after Civil War, trains, refrigeration, growth, technology.
Yeah. The story of beer, like the story of the evolution of beer in Buffalo really is the story of the evolution of the technologies. I mean, you just named a couple of the big ones. Artificial refrigeration was actually developed for beer. It turns out to be great for food too, right? I mean, there's all kinds of other uses for it. But the companies that put the money into developing it were breweries because they wanted to control fermentation temperatures, and then after that, they wanted to control, the conditioning temperature of the beer, and then they wanted to control the temperature that the beer was transported at. So rail cars, refrigerated rail cars, that was an innovation that came out of the brewing industry as well.
Wow. No, those are great things, man. And there's so much history to dive into. So the book's called Buffalo Beer.
Yes, Buffalo Beer: The History of Brewing in the Nickel City. It's Arcadia Press, and it's still in print. I think you can go to their website and pick it up. It used to be History Press, but now it's Arcadia. So the publisher's name has changed over the years.
Wow,
Still there.
well, that's a great
And
story.
it's part of a series. There is one for Brooklyn, and I think there's one for any substantial city in the U.S. There's an edition of this that was written by someone local who knows the local history.
Wow, it is fascinating. We're going to jump to another topic, talking about beer judging. One reason we booked the show today is that you said you had been judging at the GABF.
Yes.
So tell us about that, and just how you got started in judging. Are you BJCP certified? Do you have any qualifications besides being just a good brewer?
Well, you don't have to have any literal qualifications other than when you apply to get into the judges pool, you do need to get some recommendations from people that, can speak to your judging ability. They do take into account if you have any qualifications, but there's plenty of people that I was judging with who don't have BJCP or Cicerone certification. I have both. There's many levels of BJCP. I'm certified, which is not a super high level. At some point, to advance in levels in BJCP, you have to start, grading exams and helping the actual organization to accrue the points. And I've never really gone quite that far. Cicerone, I think, has 4 levels, and I'm a certified Cicerone, which is the lowest of the levels that requires an in-person comprehensive test. There's advanced and master above me. And there are not too many masters at all, actually. I think that number is still, sub 30. I don't know how many advanced Cicerones there are now. I don't really keep total track. But yeah, I got BJCP certified because I was doing so much homebrew judging and whatnot, and I wanted to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. So a lot of that is learning, to identify off flavors and to identify what causes those off flavors so that you can give the brewer good feedback as to, not just what's wrong, but why something's wrong. So after applying to be in that pool, I think it was probably 4 years between my applying to be in the pool and my being asked to come out and judge GABF. First time I did that was in 2019. And then I haven't judged since because actually 2020, right? They didn't do anything. 2021, they had a very limited judging pool because it was still sort of COVID. So this is the first time they had people, a lot of people, back in Denver to judge it. And this year they had, this is amazing, they had 9,950 entries. They had just 50 entries shy of 10,000 beers to judge.
That's
so
amazing.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's an incredible feat of organization and logistics on their side, let alone all the judging.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
I'm Jimmy Carboni, host of Beer Sessions Radio on HRN. I recently hosted a live podcasting event with local beer and spirits makers from beautiful Somerset County, New Jersey. We spoke on the farm that is home to Flounder Brewery and Belmar Distillery, one of the most beautiful stops along the Sip and See craft beverage trail.
To me, those two worlds, brewery and distillery, are extremely complementing businesses, especially in a unique location like this. So it immediately helped this become a destination to have a great experience, whether it's the beer atmosphere we've got going in here in the old barns or the great experience you can have in there with these incredible cocktails that are created there. It's complementary to each other. You can have two completely different experiences all within a 10-foot walk from each other.
Before the event, I was able to tour the area and see the historic bridge tender's house along the serene D&R Canal, walk the bike and hiking trails, and take in the lush farmland. Then we settled into the centuries-old Dutch barn turned brewery for a lively discussion.
it was always important for us to create our space, our livelihood that we want to share with everybody else, of being a community-centric location. It is what makes us a brewery in this state different from a barn or restaurant. We're obviously family-friendly here. We have a lot of different groups that have their meetings here during the week. We just really want to become a community hub.
You can listen to this episode of Beer Sessions Radio, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to Somerset County Tourism for supporting this episode. Learn more about the Sip and See Passport Program at visitsomersetnj.org. That's visit SOMERSETNJ.org.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Hey, become a member and support us at heritageradionetwork.org. There's over 30 shows each week. Food, farming, cocktails, and beer shows, all on heritageradionetwork.org. So we're talking with Ethan Cox of Community Beer Works in Buffalo, and one of the legends in New York State brewing. He had just come back from judging at the GABF, the Great American Beer Fest, and we're going to dive into that now because it's this very interesting world that I want to know more about. So how many beers were submitted for the GABF this year?
So this year they got just 50 entries shy of 10,000, 9,950 beers.
Wow.
In a number of categories, strictly speaking, there are 98 categories. Many of those categories, though, have subcategories. So the total number of categories is, like 130 or something like that. And beers are judged in 3 rounds. So you have a first round where, you have a form and you give feedback to the brewers, because if they don't get past the first round, that's the only feedback they're going to get. They're not going to get a medal. So, so you in the first round, for every beer, the judges at the table do feedback on each entry. And the standard way of doing this is a lot like what you do in BJCP as well. You get the flight of beers. You go through each beer on your own without saying anything to the other judges. You do your taste, you take your notes, and you move on to the next beer. And when you've gotten through your flight, usually 9 to 12 beers in a flight, something like that, after all the judges are done, you go back over those beers, and this time you talk about them. And you try to see if, everything that you've picked out is also what other judges have picked out, or maybe you missed something. We recognize that judges have different sort of thresholds for different kinds of flavors, right? So, like famously, one of those flavors that's generally an off flavor is called diacetyl or diacetyl. And it's kind of a buttery flavor. You've probably had it in some beers. Maybe you didn't know that it was a flaw. At very low levels in certain styles, it's kind of acceptable. But generally speaking, if you bring the beer up towards your nose and it smells like movie popcorn, you've got a diacetyl issue. Like that's way too much. Yeah.
Or sometimes the lines aren't clean in someone's draft or something.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, man, I don't even want to go there. But yeah. I mean, so many beers are ruined by the draft system, not by the brewer. But, who gets blamed? Usually the general public doesn't really realize that that's where a beer can get ruined. And so they just think the brewery is not very good. So so if you own a bar, please clean your lines. That's really something I would like you to do. Every 2 weeks, ideally. But yeah, so you talk with the other judges and you say, hey, I think I detected a little bit of this. Did anybody else get that? No, I really didn't, but then I'm not very sensitive to it. Whatever, you hash it out. Make sure that you've got a generalized agreement, and then you decide which of those beers you're going to pass forward to a medal round versus not. Then there's secondary rounds that are kind of like that, and then there's third rounds that are medal rounds.
What categories did you judge, and about how many judges were involved?
Sure. Well, the way the Brewers Association is doing it now, because they are still worried about COVID, they are still kind of breaking things up a little bit. So I was in a pool of about, I don't know, I'm going to say there was about 60 or 70 judges for that 3-day stretch. And then a day later, 60 or 70 other judges came in and did the next set of beers. And then for the final round, and I think that's kind of happening right now, or maybe just happened a day or two ago, they bring in yet another set of judges. Now, I'm not sure that you can't judge in all three. You probably could. But I was only really able to spare those 3 days. So I went out there and judged in the first round. Geez, what kinds of styles did I have? I'm trying to think. I had American fruit beers at one point. I had many rounds of American style IPA because that is one of the most popular styles, and it gets a lot of entries. So you get everybody does some rounds of IPA. It's just unavoidable. I believe this year there were like over 400 beers just in the IPA category.
Ethan, wait, when you taste, do you have a palate cleanser? Is there anything else you're eating or drinking while you taste?
Lots of water and lots of matzah. That's our palate cleanser, which it warms my heart. So yeah, you do, especially with IPAs. I mean, there's no way. Like I had to eat a fair amount of cracker in between each beer and then wash it down just to kind of reset my palate, because all of that bitterness, all of that hop flavor and aroma, but especially the bitterness, starts to build up and you just can't taste anything after a while. So you definitely need to drink a lot of water and chew on a lot of crackers. Ideally crackers without a lot of flavor, which is why matzah is perfect.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I did American amber lagers at one point, which means, not just like red ales, but also like American style Martins and stuff like that. I did a metal round of fruited wood and barrel aged sours. So any beer that has fruit in it and touched a barrel gets in that category. So that was pretty interesting.
So that could be like a framboise lambic or something.
Yeah, actually, there was one entry that was very much aimed at being like sort of a traditional lambic style, even though it was produced, by an American brewer somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think, there's usually, for especially complicated beers like that, there's usually some production notes. And I know we got one that said, spontaneous fermentation. So that's an attempt at a lambic style thing.
But
I had a round of chili beers.
Oh, wow. Did that wreck you for the day?
You know what? I was afraid that it would, but thankfully, at least the flight we got, there was only one or two of them that were like really hot. Most of the rest of them tried to use chili more as like a flavor agent than just capsaicin bomb,
like a pepper. I've had a jalapeno beer from upstate that you taste like green pepper, and it was quite good.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I had a couple that had that flavor harmoniously balanced with other elements of the beer, and it was really, really delicious. And it's not like a Cave Creek chili beer where it's just like hot and you're like, ugh, that's the way brewers are now. They're a lot more sophisticated and they're often a lot more subtle, and they're deft with their use of ingredients. And so that was true for the chili beers. But yeah, just like you were saying, like I was afraid before I got that round. I'm like, that's going to be it for me today. Holy crap, do I have to do a round after that? But it turned out that mostly they were subtle and quite nice. There were a couple that had some heat, but just drank a lot of water and ate a lot more matzah.
And you're tasting, they're all blind, right?
Completely blind. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the judges are also, really directed not to, you shouldn't even try to guess. There's no point in guessing. You're probably wrong anyway. But even if you're right, what did you gain, right? So not only do we never even discuss like, oh, I think this might have been made by X, Y, or Z, but we even try to avoid comparing it to existing beers, because that too could bias the way we think about it, right? We really try to be as blind as possible. Absolutely. And that's not a problem because all the beers are brought to us from behind a drape, behind, pipe and drape kind of stuff on the other side of the room, where an army of volunteers is pouring these out and assembling them into flights. And then they bring them out on a tray, and they're just in a little cup with a number. That's it.
Wow. Hey, did you ever win any GABF awards at Community Beer Works?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yes. One of our beers won GABF several years ago, and it's that IPA. And and it won in the American IPA category. It might have won in the session IPA category, actually, just because its ABV is like 4.5.
Wow.
And I wish I could say it won a gold, but I think it won a bronze, what I recall. But we are, I believe, until, I mean, I know they're going to announce the awards Saturday. But for the time being, we're the only brewery in Buffalo that's won a GABF award. So that's pretty cool.
Wow, man. It's
Yeah.
so not every brewery is submitting. I mean, I always thought every brewery is submitted to the GABF.
Well, that's the thing, man. You don't know who didn't submit. So, if there's some beers out there that you think like, my word, I can't believe that's never won a gold medal at GABF, it might be that they just don't submit the beer to competition. First of all, there's a fee. So every beer you enter costs you, I can't remember what the fee is right now, but every beer costs you like, I think it's like $40 a beer. You might get a break if you enter 10 or something. I'm not sure, but for sure, some breweries don't find the cost to be worthwhile because most often you don't win, right? You do get really good feedback, and so that should justify the price no matter what. But
everyone gets a tasting notes.
yeah, every beer is going to get some tasting notes, whether it goes on to a medal round or not. Now, if it gets a medal, you don't really care about the tasting notes anymore. But for sure, if you don't get a medal, and most beers are not gonna, of course, then those tasting notes are really, really. That's one of the most important things for the judges is that we give valuable feedback to the brewers, because for the price of admission, man, they deserve, quality feedback. So they understand. Maybe they don't want to change it. Maybe they're very happy with the beer as it is, but they can at least understand why it didn't didn't get a medal. That's always been a problem for us with the Whale. The Whale is a wonderful brown ale, but it doesn't fit into the British brown ale category style guidelines perfectly, and it doesn't fit into the American brown ale style guidelines perfectly. We use a clean American yeast, but we're using British malts, and especially Fawcett brown malt, which is really at the heart of the flavor of that beer. And so, because it's not really a very good British brown ale and not really a perfect American brown ale, it's a beer that is hard to win a medal with. That's always the feedback we get is like, well, this is a little too British if it's in the American category, or oh, it's a little too American if it's in the British category. So we like the beer the way it is. We're not going to change it just because it won't win, but we don't enter it anymore because I think we already know.
I like that beer a lot. That's the first beer I ever tasted that you made. Let's talk about beers. So you've got the Whale that I know, and then what if you have a flagship, do you have a pale ale flagship?
Well, we had a flagship pale ale. It was called Frank. We haven't produced it in a while now because, unfortunately, one of the downsides of the explosion of IPAs is that it's hard to sell a pale ale anymore. I mean, ask our friends down at Sierra Nevada; they're making it work, but they had to make a lot of IPAs too, right? Just like anybody. And we found that in our market, we were better off concentrating on beers that we could at least label as an IPA. I loved Frank. I thought it was a very, very good modern pale ale. Certainly inspired by Sierra Nevada, but using different hops and certainly a different malt makeup. But yeah, it's a beer that we will still produce every now and then, basically for the tap room. But it's not something that we can really move on the shelves or move through bars or restaurants in a world where IPAs reign supreme.
Yeah.
So that IPA is a flagship beer for us. It's a session IPA. The Whale is a flagship. Our flagship, like full strength IPA, is called Good Neighbor. That's 7% or so, 7.1, I think. And then some other beers that we've kind of made over and over again. Well, we've made a lot of Whale variants because a brown ale turns out to be a perfect canvas for doing kind of cool things. So like we've done like a cherry infused Whale, which is really nice. We're about to re-release our Choco Taco version of the Whale, which is bittersweet because I think they just stopped making Choco Tacos.
Well, wait,
But
what makes it Choco Taco Whale?
we literally throw waffle cones into the boil kettle and some chocolate. That
All
gets
right.
it done. Yeah,
Wow.
it's really good.
So
Yeah.
that's experimenting, right?
It is, and it's along the lines of the sort of pastry stout kind of thing that people are into these days. Um, let's see, what else? What else qualifies as sort of a regular beer for us? Oh well, our other big seller, especially right now this time of year, is a light lager that's called Let's Go Pills. If you're a brewery in Buffalo right now and you don't make a beer that ties into the bills, you're a fool. We've been making that beer for several years before the bills became good again. But yeah, Let's Go Pills is a light American lager. It uses some rice and some corn. So some people might say that's not craft, but I would say whatever, we make it. Um, and that's a good seller, especially during football season, as you might
Wow.
assume.
So the quick
Yeah,
backstory on the whale, the brown ale. It's
yeah.
doesn't fit those GABF beer styles, but it's really
Mm.
good. Um,
Yeah.
when did you guys first make that? And what's the backstory on it as a brewer, as a brewery owner?
Hmm.
Because even now,
Well,
when you
actually,
say brown ale to me, I love brown ales, I love porters, I love black lagers. But it,
oh yeah.
what's your backstory on that?
Hmm. So I think I mentioned when I was telling the background. I wasn't the brewer. When we started off, our brewer was a guy named Rudy, and he's actually the brewer at Thin Man now, and has been for a while. But he brought that recipe to us when we started. It was one of his homebrew recipes, and he had a different name for it, I think, at the time. So, and we decided that I think he wanted to call it the brown whale. And I think we looked that up on Urban Dictionary, which is always a good idea when you're about to put a beer out there. And we decided, okay, maybe we won't call it the brown whale, but it's a brown ale, so that's kind of redundant anyway. So we just shortened it to the whale. But it was absolutely one of Rudy's homebrew recipes, pretty unmodified, and the main malt that drives the flavor is a British malt called Fawcett Brown Malt. And I think when Rudy constructed that recipe, he was literally thinking, how can I make a beer taste as much like Fawcett Brown Malt as possible? And like if from cooking, if you want something to have a certain flavor, you need to use other flavors to really bring that out. You don't just like go straight up with one flavor. You need contrasting flavors and other complementary flavors to really get to where you want to go. So it uses a fair proportion of Fawcett Brown malt, but it also uses a couple different kinds of chocolate malt to really drive that Fawcett Brown malt flavor. Yeah, delicious, delightful, lighter than you think. I mean, it's dark in color, but it's not heavy. It doesn't have a very thick mouthfeel. It's actually a fairly easy drinking beer,
That's what I love,
and
man.
it goes really well.
Dark beers that drink light. I love them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's you mentioned like dark lagers, which same idea, right? Um, but it also pairs really well with a lot of food. I think of it as being a great culinary beer. Um, people don't drink as many dark beers in the summer, but if you think about a lot of what you cook in the summer, stuff that comes off the grill, be it fish or meat or vegetables, it's going to have that blackened Maillard reaction, which is also what makes brown malt brown. So those flavors go really well together. And I think that for grilling season, brown ales are usually a really good complement to what you're eating, depending on
You
what
know
else is
that
going on.
this summer I probably drank more like dark lagers, black lagers, with summer food than IPAs. And that's
Hmm.
neat because I've never talked to anyone about that before. Because so many pairings, people were saying IPA with grill, IPA with barbecue, but
Nah, yeah.
I agree with you. Oh yeah,
Yeah, I mean, IPAs are hard to pair, I find. They are a great drinking beer on their own, but because a lot of their flavors and aromas are so extreme, they can't, and especially, modern IPAs are a lot less bitter. But, back 3, 4, 5 years ago or a decade, certainly. Bitterness was a big feature of IPAs too, and bitterness is a tough one. When you're in a pairing situation, you need to find something to contrast that with to really make it work. And so you find like sweet things. But one of the unusual pairings that really works with IPAs, check this out sometime if you get a chance, carrot cake.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Because the carrot is neutral sweet?
Well, all the spicing in a carrot cake is not too far off from your pumpkin spices, right? It's a little bit of like allspice. It's a little bit maybe a cinnamon or of clove, and those flavors just make a really good contrast to the piney and the resinous flavors in hops. They make a good contrast to the floral flavors in hops if you got those kinds of hops. Now, if you're loaded up with tropical hops, which is pretty much in fashion these days, I'm not sure if that's going to work as well with a carrot cake. Actually, now that I think about it, but your older school, your West Coast IPAs, with that little bit of crystal malt sweetness, it's perfect.
That sounds great. Actually, last night I was tasting a bunch of hot sauces with some folks, and we kept finding hints of carrot in them. And
oh wow.
I think, well, yeah, like a lot of Northeastern farm-based sauces. I mean, carrot's affordable and accessible. It does provide a nice base. It's like neutral sweetness. That's what I thought you were thinking about too. That might help. That might help also with the bitterness. But that's neat,
yeah, I think
man.
That's right.
Talk about other beers. It was last winter we started. It's funny. This show was a work in progress. Where since last winter, one time on Facebook, I don't know what we were talking about, a collab or a holiday beer. And I'm not even sure what started it, but I think we pulled up a Ron Patterson, like a 1900, like a high hop, high gravity beer. I don't know if you want to. I don't know. Were you asking for a holiday beer? What was the start of that conversation? Because
we were talking about holiday beers.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. We were talking about like what makes a good Christmas beer. And so I think we were trying to riff on that. And I think that you brought up Ron Pattinson and one of these like older beer styles. And I bounded on over to my bookcase and pulled out that very book. And we talked about some of those old recipes that he's kind of reconstructed. And some breweries have gone and actually made commercial versions. And I think that's really, really cool. Of course, it's really hard to actually make a beer just like it used to be made because those malts maybe don't exist anymore. You might not know what kind of yeast they used. That might not be in the recipe. And you might not be able to even get those kinds of hops anymore. Hops kind of come and go. But for sure, there are some really, really good examples of contemporary versions of older beers. And I think we were talking specifically about one of the ones that was made by Pretty Things. That was one of those Ron Pattinson beers.
Yeah, Ron Pattinson, man, and Pretty Things was. I remember it. It was like 8%, and I don't want to like wax nostalgic, but you probably have this experience. I do. I remember beers that I loved, and I go back to them.
Yeah.
That Pretty Things beer was special. It was like 8%. It was hoppy. It was dark. It was a joy.
Yep.
So we were talking about old Ron Patterson recipes and.
Yeah, and the old the Pretty Things Ale and Beer project that was out of Somerville, Mass. A guy named Dan Paquette and his wife Martha, who left the industry in the U.S. and actually went back to Britain, and they are still brewing to this day. I can't remember the name of the brewery they were working with or for now, but they were one of those early, gypsy brewing type outfits as well. They eschewed the cost of putting their own brewery together, and instead they made all of those Pretty Things beers at other breweries in Massachusetts, which was an innovative model at the time. There was just them and I think Stillwater and maybe a couple others that were using that sort of model. Most of those companies eventually started their own breweries.
I know, Evil Twin and
yeah.
And it was also, again, I don't want to say it was romantic, that it was like pirates. All these people figuring out ways to start a brewery, just like you did. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and you learned a lot. You definitely learned a lot, man. It's great talking to you. The last thing is, what other beers do you drink? You're in Buffalo.
hmm
What are a couple of beers that you drink? You were on the New York State Brewers Association board for a few years.
hmm
Going to give a shout out to a few other brewers and breweries that you know.
No, absolutely. I'm always happy to do that. So I'll tell you what. I'll give you a local. I'll give you a New York State, and then I'll give you something that's more like global/worldwide
All
as far
right.
as a pick. Yeah. Um, in Buffalo right now, we have a lot of great breweries. One of my favorites is called Autark, Autark. They're a very small brewery, also on the west side of Buffalo, and they just opened up pretty recently. Um, and I know the brewer slash owner. He's a good guy. His name is Joe DePrima. He's been putting this brewery together for well over 5 years, just taking his time, just doing it right. And he produces a lot of like lower gravity beers, so lighter in ABV. And one of my favorites is his British mild. Nobody's really making a mild on the regs, but he does. And it's a lovely 3.5, maybe 3.6% beer. And it's exactly what a British mild promises to be. It's got a nice malt character, has just enough of a noble hop character to count, but it's not a hoppy beer. And it's at an ABV where you can just sit there at his lovely little brewery and tap room and drink a bunch of them and then hop on your bike and ride safely home. So,
Wow, that's a great
um,
intro.
yeah, yeah, no, that I'm very fond of him and what he's doing, and I think smaller breweries that sell all of their beer in their own tap rooms are the way of the future, and he's a really good example of that. We got a few others like that in Buffalo that just opened too, but he's one of my favorites.
So that's Autark.
Atark, yeah,
Autark.
Autark,
Autark.
Atark. Yeah, I don't know where that name comes from or what it means. To be honest, I should ask.
All right.
Okay, so that's in Buffalo. New York State. I mean, in New York State right now, the one of the most impressive beer makers is just up the river from you in the Hudson Valley, and that would be Suarez. Um, I think that guy has got something that most brewers don't. Some kind of a touch, some kind of an understanding. His beers are poetry. And what he does especially well, he's really good with like sours and spontaneous fermentation. I really like those beers. But for my money, his Pilsners are out of this world. He makes three, in fact, different Pilsners. He makes one called Palatine, and trying to remember the name of the other two right now, but the Palatine Pils in particular is my favorite of the three. And it's just a lovely, crisp German style Pilsner made with, I think, pretty much all New York State ingredients, but possibly some German malt. I'm not even sure. I can tell you, though, that it tastes exactly right. It is one of the most refreshing, amazing Pilsners that I've had outside of actual German Pilsners in Germany or certain breweries in Denver, like Prost or Bierstadt. So, yeah, Suarez, Palatine Pils.
Huge compliment. That's a great one. And then beyond New York.
Well, beyond New York, right now, I'm drinking a Sam Adams Oktoberfest. I was inspired to do that by another show where people were talking about it, and I thought to myself, it's been a while since I've had one of those, but they are fresh right now. Now's the time to get them. So I scooted on over to our local Wegmans and picked up a 12 pack of Sam Adams Oktoberfest, and man, from the first sip, I was kind of just reminded about how much I love a malt forward, but still, a relatively light, easy drinking beer. I mean, this comes in at 5.3. And it's got some noble hop character. It's certainly not hopless, but this is a beer that's really about malt and the nice complexity and depth of this like sweetness and this breadiness. And yet it finishes really crisp. And around this time of year, there's nothing I'd rather do than crack open my first Oktoberfest of the year, and this was it this year, and I am very satisfied with that. So Sam Adams Oktoberfest.
Ethan, I'm so happy we got to talk, and we will definitely again have another show together with some other guests. But thanks so much for taking the time and calling in.
Absolutely.
And you're the best, man. So thanks to Ethan Cox. Big thanks to Armin Spengen, our engineer, and Alex Tran, our producing intern. I'm Jimmy Carboni here on Heritage Radio Network. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
All right.
Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.